It was choking on its own silt. That sounds very extravagant, but that was how it was described in the early 18th century by an author called J.C., who was writing a book about the coal trade. And he said something to the effect that it wasn't worth trying to get into the harbour at Sunderland because it was useless. It was hopeless to get in. He was a Newcastle man as well, I hasten to add. Because the trouble is the weir meanders. You know, as you look up here, you can see it meandering. And a meandering river will deposit large amounts of silt. It has a sandy bottom. So by the early 18th century, it was in quite a severe condition. But the other side of the coin, it's supply and demand here. The other side of the coin is that throughout the 17th century, the coal trade in Sunderland had become much more significant, partly because of the stimulus of the English Civil War. During the English Civil War, the Newcastle hostmen backed the wrong side, I'm pleased to say, and we backed the right side. We were parliamentarian. And the result of that was that Sunderland dominated the coal trade down the east coast of London, which is the main segment of the coal trade. There was an attempt in 1705 to establish riverway commissioners then, and that was choked by the Newcastle interests. There's no doubt at all the Newcastle interest blocked Sunderland's development. I want to echo that. If you look at the first page of the Act of Parliament, which granted them powers, they pressed all the right buttons. They said that by developing the harbour, they would increase the wealth of the country. That was always a good marker. They would increase employment, and in a period of social disturbance, it was always a valuable thing to increase employment, to keep people off the streets. And it would also stimulate the mercantile marine, because sailors in the Royal Navy, because sailors in the Royal Navy were usually press-ganged or volunteered from the Merchant Navy. So they obviously played the monopoly card game of how to get an Act of Parliament through. They pressed all the right buttons. Charles the Bell came and he wrote a very thorough report indeed. And in this he pointed out that Sunderland had actually had two channels. You can't see it today, but they actually had two channels, a north channel and a south channel. And his recommendation was that all of the force of the water should be concentrated to the south channel. So what was then done was that the north channel over the next few years was blocked by sinking redundant colliers and by building what are called training jetties. And the purpose of the training jetties was actually to accumulate silt. And that's what they did. And the south channel, well, fairly quickly began to drive away or to reduce the bar. Not many people realise that Sunderland was the first place in the world to use steam-powered mechanical dredging. And a dredger was usually manned by 3 or 4 men who must have stank pretty awfully by the end of the day. It's a pretty dirty job, this. And it was manually powered. In the late 18th century, Pickernell, who was then the harbour engineer, came up with the splendid idea of putting a steam engine in a keel and attaching that to the dredge. Like a lot of brilliant ideas, it's obvious, really. Put it all together, and for about 10 years, the first steam-powered mechanical dredge in the world was operating in Sunderland. Like a lot of organisations which are effective, the more effective the commissioners were, the more the problem grew. Because the more effective they were, the greater the volume of trade in the River Wear, and the greater the volume of trade in the River Wear, the busier the commissioners were in trying to regulate it and manage it and to improve the flow of the river. By the early 1820s and 1830s, it was pretty obvious that the absence of wet dock facilities was the great handicap then. And in the 1820s, a man called Robert Stevenson, he produced a report in which he recommended consideration of 3 or 4 possible sites for the building of a dock, one of which was the Wearmouth dock just around the corner here. The problem with that was that although it was the easiest place to build a dock, it was also going to be the smallest dock. And most of the coal trade, frankly, was on the south side of the river anyhow. There were other possibilities. One was the south dock over here. The trouble with the south dock area was that it impinged upon public property. That was where the army barracks were, and the common moor, which of course was common land. So the first dock was built actually in the least suitable place. And the man who was employed as consulting engineer was none other than Isambard Kingdom Brunel. And the result of that was that the Wearmouth dock was always a failure, really, frankly. It was known as Sir Hedworth's bathtub because it was too small for the coal trade. So by the 1830s, we were in the worst of all possible worlds. Having come to the conclusion that we needed a dock, the dock we'd built was unsuitable. Now with the south dock, the answer there actually was to build jetties out into the sea. They're called groins, in fact, so that this would accumulate silt around the groins. It would actually build the land around the dock, which in effect is what happens in the 1840s and 50s. And the man who comes up with that splendid wheeze is a man whom I admired tremendously, but I've never seen him. He's a picture of him. It's a man called John Murray, a Scotsman, a Scottish engineer, and he was the harbour engineer here then in the 1840s. And at that particular moment, George Hudson, Railway King of York, his rather corpulent figure emerges onto the scene. And George Hudson was looking for a seat, a parliamentary seat. He came to Sunderland. He promised that he would fund and support the building of a south dock, which would be the outlet of his North Eastern Railway system. You bring together George Hudson's money and George Hudson's railways with John Murray's engineering ability, and you end up with the south dock. So, putting it all together, by the 1850s we actually had one of the most pioneering dock complexes in Western Europe, I think, really. The problem by the later 19th century was the need to provide a sheltered entrance to the harbour. What they came up with were two great protective arms. It's opened in 1903 officially, so work is going on for about 15 years on the work up here, to such an extent that you can see many, many pictures where people have clearly come down to the harbour to spend the day, as they would do today on the beach. But one of the entertainments, of course, is the great Goliath crane, which is trundling backwards and forwards with these great granite blocks and facing stones.
Well, 2017 is very much a year of celebration. It's a celebration of what our founding fathers in the River Wear Commission did and their foresight of investment in a facility to provide economic development opportunities to its river and to its town and now to a city. Ports gave our region, and specifically our city, their reason for being and enabled them to access new markets for historical goods and services. But the significance now to the city of the port is that it will enable us to move forward in some really exciting new market opportunities. So it's a time for celebration and reflection on what they've done.